The Money Show.
Business Books.
Some people can't tell their is from their ahs. I tell you that much. Bronwyn Williams, however, can. The trend translator and future finance specialist at Flux Trends. How good are you on grammar, Bronwyn? Because we've got to fight something out first before we talk about tonight's business book.
I'm good enough at grammar to break the rules.
You're good enough at grammar to break the rules. Excellent. Well, I think a rule has been broken here because the title of this book that you are reviewing for us this evening, Breach, How the Next Generation Are Consciously Disrupting the World. Surely how the next generation is consciously disrupting the world? Discuss.
I think that's a matter of opinion. I'll stick with what Ronen said there. I'm sure he knows what he was doing. Exactly what he was doing there.
Who is this one-man destroyer of the English language, Ronen Ayres?
Yes, Ronen is, of course, the founder, or at least one of the founders and current sort of leader of Student Village. So he's been working with young people for quite some time, since he was a young person until he is now, as he describes himself, a young elder, which is a nice way of saying early middle-aged. So he's been in the sort of the youth insights game for quite a long time, working with corporates to try and bring them insights as to what young people, particularly people of student age, are thinking, feeling, doing, buying, selling, planning on, working in and building on one day.
Okay, so Ronen Ayres, the author, therefore, is looking at youth as disruptors. And this isn't a particularly new idea, but I suppose in the generation that we are in, there are new iterations to it. Because youth have always disrupted. Youth have stood up against nuclear. They've stood up against the Vietnam War. They've stood up now standing up against global warming and countless other issues that the internet is enabling them to gather on virtually and pick a fight on almost any topic under the sun. The youth have always been disruptors. They're just more prevalent perhaps now than ever before.
Well, I'm not even sure if it's more prevalent than ever before, but just every generation has its chance to disrupt the status quo. And most generations do, except for my generation. And your listeners/readers, when they get to this tomorrow morning, are welcome to fight me on this point. But I think the one thing that stands out for my generation, and I am one of the hapless millennials right in the middle of that bunch, is that we have absolutely and surprisingly failed to disrupt the reality that was handed to us by previous generations. But what we're seeing now with the next generation, as what is termed as Generation Z, or here in South Africa, the born-free generation, is that they are behaving like young people and like teenagers are expected to behave once again by challenging their elders. And I think it's been particularly difficult, particularly for companies trying to deal with selling to and managing this Generation Z generation, because they are such a defined generational cohort. Now, there has been a lot of criticism, even with people and companies who have absolutely built their careers and their companies on generational cohort studies, like Pew Research Center quite recently saying, oh no, we must stop using generational cohorts because they are just meaningless stereotypes. I would challenge their challenge in saying that this particular cohort, particularly in a South African context, is bookmarked both on birth and in graduation into the job market with very defined pivotal global events, or at least national events, in that this is a generation that was born after the end of apartheid, which was a pretty significant watershed moment for our country. Few would deny that. And they graduated right into lockdown. So in other words, they started their life on pause and had time to consider having a gap between being a child and being an adult. And they spent that time largely online and largely isolated. And this has definitely meant that they have entered into the workplace as now consumers and as workers as a defined cohort that companies are really struggling to manage. I work in quite a similar space to Ronen. We work with companies trying to help them to plan their futures and figure out the future of work and that sort of thing. And they all of our clients, both Ronen's and mine, have the same issue. We don't know what to do with these people. They seem to be ungovernable and unmanageable. And both Ronen and I tend to agree this is not necessarily a bad thing.
No, but that's
good. Didn't a little.
That is the point, though. I mean, humanity makes progress based on disruption. And that disruption generally comes from younger generations of people who are looking at the status quo and going, no, that's not the best way to do it. And we've got a better idea. Right? Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So,
and they're always right when they challenge, but it's a good thing they are challenging.
No, exactly right. I mean, and again, you can either then have two very, very clear groups of people, older people saying to young people, you don't know what you talk about, we're in charge, shut up and obey, which doesn't get a great response. Or you can say to younger people, to Generation Z, you can say, that's interesting. Why don't you bring it into a room and let's talk about it? Or we'll have a virtual call about it. We'll talk about it there. Or send us a WhatsApp, or, send us a Snapchat, whatever it is, however you want to communicate your idea. Communicate your ideas and let's engage those ideas in a far more mature way than perhaps has been happening to date.
Yes, exactly. It's not very productive just to dismiss an entire generation of people who are going to be the people that buy whatever you are selling and will have to, at some point, do the work that you're required to get done out of hand. At the same time, this generation is kind of a generation of contrasts too, in that they are challenging to authority. They do ask the questions that perhaps millennials didn't ask too much or complained about in private rather than sort of complained about in public in challenging ways. But they also have a sort of there's this sort of a darker side to what's gone on with them. And that's also the challenge of nihilism. And there's also a sense of kind of completely destructive apathy, right? So I think that's always a kind of choice. You kind of got this generation that sees the world as it is clearly broken. We have a permanent everything bubble, it seems, in the economy, which is just perpetuating inequality. And they sense this and understand this quite strongly. They're also the generation that's been handed the bill for paying for all of the climate and environmental sort of reparations that previous generations have kind of kicked down the road. So they have a chip on their shoulder. So on the one hand, we see some of this generation opting into lying down flat movements, which is something that came out of China, where people would graduate and then just decide not to want to go and get a job, want to have the minimum participation in life altogether. We see in South Africa here with voter apathy, or with being stuck in, as they're terming it now in academic circles, weighted, this protracted adolescence that's been perpetuated through things like lockdowns and things like poverty and things like lack of availability of jobs. It can translate into apathy and surrealism and like online escapism on the one hand, but on the other hand, confronted with this sort of messy and very unfair reality, we also see the other side of this cohort that is challenging, that is making a difference. It's getting involved with politics, getting involved with business at a much younger age than the previous cohorts, that would be me and my peers, once again, did anything with people their age. So it's a very interesting group to manage. And what is coming across, though, and I think one of the interesting points that Ronen touches in this book here, is how this is a generation that is very happy to cut their losses and cut their ties with things and people and places that are no longer serving them. So in other words, all ties become loose ties. And there's a sort of impatience when it comes to what brands they're going to support, an intolerance of brand hypocrisy, if you're on that sort of side of the world of work. And same thing with working for companies, unhappy and unwilling to work with companies that promise you a promotion, several years down the line and then fail to deliver on that. They kind of want instant participation. They want to see that whatever effort they're putting in is going to have a result in quite the short term. They're not prepared to wait it out for that golden handshake at the end of your career. So again, it's very much a sort of a kind of a Socrates way of looking at the world, where you want to have a little, or an Aristotle way of looking at the world, where you want to have a bit of balance here, right? Yeah. So there's the darkness and the light in all of these sort of points that come across in the book, which I think is very, very interesting.
You used a term, destructive apathy. Is that yours? Is that Ronen's? Is that something you picked up elsewhere? Destructive apathy. Just discuss this concept with me, because this whole notion of, okay, fine, we got to eat, so we might as well work. But I'm not going to work for, large corporate A, B, or C. I'll bide my time, make a crust, and be miserable about it. Is that the notion of destructive apathy, or is it a little bit more involved?
No, almost the opposite. Like, I'm not prepared to do that at all. I'd rather do nothing than do something that doesn't serve my ends. I think a great example there, something that I've had to, out of not necessarily by my own free will, but I just sort of ended up doing that over the last few months, has been speaking quite a lot about the Tweezy movement here in South Africa, which I think is a great example of that sort of destructive apathy, like nihilism, right? Energy used for no particular end, or to work against the system rather than with the system, right? So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think it does. Thank you. And I also wonder if, and you're very rude about the millennial generation. I wonder if the millennial generation...
It's like comedy. You're allowed to punch your own.
No, I suspect so. But did millennials just simply hit a sweet spot where there was really nothing considerable to rail against, nothing sort of unified them together? Where if you were born before 1990, or you were sentient before 1994, you could stand up against apartheid, you could stand up against nuclears, you could do all sorts of other things. Whereas after post-apartheid, we went to a global sweet spot. Inflation fell. There was very little to hate, frankly, in the world at that time, and kind of it was really good. And so that you didn't have a rallying cry. There is a rallying cry for the Gen Z generation, which is why older generations need to be paying attention, because Gen Z are the people who are going to be paying the taxes that will look after you in your old age. You better listen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's there again with the millennial generation. There was an expectation reality gap. Like, we were brought up in times of absolute prosperity. Like, we were born into the 80s, everything bigger, better, booming, up, massive 80s, where we kind of led to expect that we could be anyone, we could do anything, like our parents all told us we were the participation trophy generation that everybody laughed at, right? And we all grew up thinking we were going to be famous and rich, and then we all ended up being social media managers. It's been very disappointing for my generation, right? Whereas the Generation Z kind of grew up in a world of more turmoil. They graduated, as I said, literally into the mess that was COVID. So they almost had lower expectations. This is a generation since primary school has been told they're going to probably die in their lifetime thanks to climate change. That's an exaggeration, but these are the messages that they've absorbed. So they have much lower expectations in a much larger sense that if anything's going to happen, they're going to have to do it. So again, that can either turn you into an activist, or it can turn you into sort of destructive apathy, depending on your personality type there. But there's one more point that I think that this generation, that just makes this generation what it is, either leaders or just complete dropouts from society. And that would be, as Ronen says in his book at the beginning of one of his chapters, I think it's quite a good quote, where have all the leaders gone? I've been thinking about that a lot lately. Ask yourself, who are 3 current leaders you can look up to? If you can think of one, you're doing well. And that's the world that this generation is entering into.
Yeah. And his main point here, he said, look, he's not done it because he's scared. All right. He admits to being frightened of the space that we're in, because he says, as we need to use our roles as elders to empower the youth to make this world a better place. They've inherited a messed up world. They're angry about it. Adults are pushing back because they don't understand where these young people are coming from. That's common through history as well. But if we kind of find a way to meet somewhere, can we get better outcomes with older people listening to younger people in a way that makes younger people treat older people as wise rather than out of touch, disconnected and lost from the future?
Absolutely. As with families, they just work better when different generations get along with each other. I don't know if you've definitely been privileged enough to have children. Hopefully you were privileged enough to have your parents around the same time.
Yep.
You've had children. There's something wonderful about parents and grandchildren getting together and learning from each other.
Yep.
And we understand this intuitively in our families. The same thing needs to start taking place in the workplace. And that's, again, something we've also seen coming through in our work. There's all these trends towards reverse mentoring programs where you get older people paired up with younger people to share skills on the one hand and sort of contemporary culture, consciousness, technology, whatever it is on the other hand, things like shadow boards, getting young people involved even at higher levels of the organization. So again, just share ideas and to work across rather than against each other, to see younger people, if you are an older person, not as a sort of a warring faction, but rather as something and someone that you can learn from, right? And it's much more happy when we see it that way, when we understand we are different and that there's nothing wrong with being different, and it's not wrong to belong to any particular generation, but rather that we can share and accommodate each other's strengths and weaknesses. Like, I just love the thing about intelligence and how intelligence patterns shift as we get older. When we get older, we lose our ability to be more divergent in terms of our intelligence, but we increase our ability to be more focused in our intelligence, right? So you really do want, if you are an organization, to embrace both those lenses and those ways of thinking. Otherwise, you are not going to be so future resilient from a very economic perspective too.
Bronwyn Williams, thank you. She's a trend translator, future finance specialist at Flux Trends. The books, Breach, How the Next Generation are consciously disrupting the world. I agree with everything else Ronen says. I do. Except the title. How the Next Generation is Consciously Disrupting. But if you are looking for the book, it's How the Next Generation are Consciously Disrupting the World.